There you go. Sorry about that. I'm going to get started. I'll let anybody else in if they come. But thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for this presentation from Kathy Schrenk on her new book about the Katy Trail. Really quick before we get started, if you are doing the summer reading program, or if you're interested in doing the summer reading program through the Kirkwood Public Library, it's lots of fun. You win fun prizes just for reading books. We do also have raffles, and so there are missions and challenges to earn those raffle tickets. One of them is to attend an event, which is what you're doing right now. It's going to ask for a code word if you go into summer reading to complete that. Join us for an event challenge, and that code word is WILD, W-I-L-D. So you put that into the challenge and it will qualify you for a raffle ticket. You can pick that up here at the library and enter for fabulous prizes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy to tell you about the Katy Trail.
Great. Thank you so much to Amanda Tew and the Kirkwood Library for having me for this virtual event. As Amanda said, my name is Kathy Schrenk. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then we can start talking about the Katy. I live in Kirkwood. I've lived here for about 8 years and I've been a writer basically my whole life. And this is my second book about the Katy Trail book is my second book that I've written about the outdoors. Amanda, do you want to allow people to just ask questions as we go, or do you have a preferred way to handle that? I'm fine either way. I don't mind being interrupted.
Whichever you are comfortable with. So I think everybody has the ability to unmute themselves if they want to ask a question. So yeah, feel free to do that if you have a question, and we'll go from there.
Okay. And if are you able to monitor the chat in case somebody types something in?
I can do that, yeah.
Okay, yeah, then just holler out. So I'm happy to stop and be interrupted and answer questions or get comments or what have you. Okay, so I have written this book about the Katy Trail. It came out last month, and the Katy Trail itself is what's known as a Rails to Trails project. And what that means is that it is a pedestrian and bike trail that is built on an old railroad line. So as you probably know, when the automobile became kind of the focus of transportation in the US after World War II, and trucking was kind of the main way that, or one of the main ways that goods were shipped, a lot of railroads went out of business. So the Katy was a railroad that was started in Missouri and came through Missouri, Kansas, and then down to Texas. So it was called the Missouri, Kansas, Texas line, which was shortened to the MKT, and then colloquially that was shortened to Katy. So that's why it's called the Katy Trail. The Rails to Trails program started in the 60s, was kind of when it was born, and when people started noticing that there were these disused or abandoned rail lines, and that these corridors would make really great bike paths. They're mostly flat because railroads needed mostly flat areas to for the grades for the trains to go through. And excuse me, the Katy is actually the longest Rails to Trails project in the country. It was founded in 1990, was when the very first section opened out in the central part of the state. It goes from east of St. Charles. There's a little town called Watkins, but there's hardly anything there besides the Katy Trail trailhead. And then it goes all the way west in the state to Clinton, Missouri, which is not too far from Kansas City. So you can almost ride your bike on a dedicated trail from St. Louis to Kansas City. And hopefully that will be expanded in the next decade or so. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Excuse me. So my research for this book, I rode every mile of the Katy Trail at least twice. I did not ride it all at once. I have not had the opportunity to do some bike packing and camp or stay at bed and breakfast along the way. I hope to do that someday because it's really set up for that. when the trail was conceived in the 90s, at first it was kind of controversial. Some of these little rural towns were not excited about a bunch of people riding their bikes and hiking in their backyards, but it ended up really being a boon for a lot of these places. All kinds of restaurants and bed and breakfasts and camping hostels and things have sprung up around the trail. And my book is laid out in such a way that you could do that all at once. You could ride from end to end in like a week or so, and lots of people do that. And it's also set up in sections so that you can pick a section, or say, you want to do a 20-mile ride or a 30-mile ride, or even less than that. You could just do like a couple hours. You can kind of pick and choose what your interests are and where you want to go in the state. And this is a way to learn more about that. So here's the logo for the Katy, and one of the photos that I took out in the western part of the state. It's really there's so much scenic variety and different things to see. And it's also a great activity all year round. It's 4 seasons. Fall especially is a great time. As you can see, this is kind of early fall. The leaves are starting to fall. And then when you get to winter, you start to see a lot of really big views because the leaves are off the trees and you can see across these bluffs across the river. And the weather in the winter is, in my opinion, more conducive in Missouri to a long bike ride. So as long as you're prepared, you can really do a ride on the Katy any time of year. So as I said, the book itself is broken down into sections, starting in the west. Clinton, Missouri is a county seat of the county that's out there near Kansas City. It's got some really interesting architecture. It's got a town square that's really interesting and beautiful. Actually, it really reminds me of those scenes in the Back to the Future movies where Marty McFly is in Hill Valley, and all this bustling business is taking place around this central square. And one day when I was there, they were having a classic car show, and it really kind of felt like going back in time a little bit and seeing some like kind of old time Missouri sort of history as it was being lived right there in front of me. Sedalia is another really interesting town that's on the western side of the state, and kind of in the first 50 miles or so of the Katy Trail. This is the historic train station that's, as you can see, right there on the Katy, and they have some of the old rail lines still there. Sedalia is also where the state fair is. So it's a big hub in the western part of the state. It's got a really interesting history, which I didn't know anything about. Scott Joplin kind of came up there and went to school and got his start in music. And they have a Scott Joplin festival in Sedalia every year. It's also got a really amazing downtown. There's an Amtrak stop there. So that's one thing that you can do with your bike is you can get on, say, in Kirkwood, or some of the other stops along the Katy, like Washington, Missouri, Herman, Missouri, right across the river from the Katy. Those have Amtrak stops. And so you can really put together a nice ride where you can put your bike on Amtrak and go out to the middle of the state and then ride your bike back. And as I said, if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to share something, just feel free to stop me. The Rock Island Trail is a connection that is part of the trail in that region. It's kind of an up and coming trail. It's much less developed than the Katy, but it has the potential to create a huge loop kind of through the entire state. Right now, it connects the Katy Trail in Windsor, Missouri, which is kind of between Clinton and Sedalia, all the way to Kansas City. So you can't actually, if you get off of the Katy Trail at Clinton, you can actually go all the way to Kansas City. That region is a little bit different. The trail departs from the river, the Missouri River, in that section, and goes over some rolling ranch land. So I said before that the Katy is pretty flat. It's very, very flat between Sedalia and the end of it, in St. Charles, because it's right along the river. There's a little bit of rolling hills and some ranch lands that you'll go through, and it's very scenic. It's almost flat. It's very close to being flat. It's just a little bit more hilly than the rest of the trail. And then you get out to Booneville, which is another really scenic, cute, downtown, historic river town. So a lot of these cities that are now, Katy Trail towns, where they have all this infrastructure around the Katy, they started out as river towns. One thing that's really interesting to me, history-wise, about the Katy is that it's been this corridor for exploration and westward expansion since before the U.S. was founded. Lewis and Clark came through this region, obviously, on the Missouri River. Daniel Boone, even before that, and we'll talk about him a little bit more later. I learned some really interesting things about Daniel Boone. His history is part of this region. The Santa Fe Trail began in Franklin, Missouri, which is very close to Booneville, out in the western part of the state. And then once you're on the trail, you get to see these great views like this. This one on the river, especially, that is very close to Rocheport, which is a little town that's not easy to get to by car, but it's right there on the Katy, and it's probably one of the most scenic parts of the trail, in my opinion. You start out in Rocheport, and there's this really cute little downtown. There's cafes, there's bed and breakfast, there's antique stores, and then you go east and you see scenes like this. And there's these soaring cliffs. There are places where you can see the remnants of Indian rock art on these cliffs. There's caves, some of which you can go into and some of which you can't. There's this bridge that is I-70 going over the river. That's where the bridge crosses, where the Katy Trail crosses I-70. And this is also in Rocheport, this tunnel. It's the only place on the Katy where they actually had to blast through and create a tunnel for the train to get through. As I was saying about the history of the Katy, once the river boats, like as I said, a lot of these towns started out as river boat towns, and so they would get a lot of commerce that way. And then once trains, in the 1800s became the way to travel, they transitioned to railroad towns. The way that the towns are spaced is really convenient for cyclists. They're kind of 10 miles apart because that's how things were spaced in the 1800s. You wanted to have your train stations close enough together that someone on a horse and buggy could come out from their farm in a day and get their supplies that had come in on the railroad. This postcard is of the Booneville Bridge. That is a really neat, not now a working bridge, but they're hoping to restore that so that they can sort of give downtown Booneville a boost and have people be able to walk or bike across that and kind of use that as an extension of the Katy Trail. As it is now, the local road that goes across the Missouri, there's a dedicated bike and pedestrian lane, so it's very safe to ride across there. And then this is another photo of some of those soaring cliffs that I was talking about that are really wonderful along that section west of Rocheport. Those of you who went to University of Missouri at Columbia are probably familiar with the big Bur Oak. That is the famous tree that they think is about 350 years old. It's at right on the Katy Trail. You can see it from the trail. It's in the middle of a big field, and it's kind of just by itself. And so folks who went to the zoo are very familiar with it, and they kind of go and heard of weddings happening there and proposals. So that's really close to this Rocheport section as well. And then if you want, you can actually ride on a paved trail to Columbia. So now, once we get past Columbia in the middle of the state, we get close to Jefferson City. So as you can see, there is a pretty great view of the Capitol from the Katy Trail. You can also ride on a dedicated bridge lane. As I mentioned, in Booneville, there's a dedicated lane. There's also a dedicated lane for bikes and pedestrians in Jefferson City. So you can be on the Katy Trail and then ride maybe about a mile on some very quiet streets, and then get to a pedestrian bridge that kind of zigzags and ramps up to the bridge where the cars actually go over to Jefferson City on the highway, but you're protected the whole time. And it's really a nice detour from the Katy to go to Jeff City, tour the Capitol complex. And when it's open, which I think it is now after the pandemic, or as the pandemic has eased, you can go in and see the amazing artwork and historic exhibits that they have there in the Capitol building. This other photo on this slide is of Herman, and it's also known as the Deutschheim Historic Site. It's a state park in the town of Herman, which you're probably familiar with because of the tourism there. That's kind of their main deal in Herman, Missouri. The wineries are a really big deal in Herman. And it's kind of the western end of the Missouri wine country. The Katy is really set up nicely for touring that wine country. So if that's the kind of thing you are interested in, if you love wine, if you love to go to wineries, doing it on your bike on the Katy Trail is really a great way to do it. I even have an itinerary in my book that kind of gives you a 2-day tour. So you can start kind of in Augusta and go west and hit all the wineries, and there's lots of places to stay overnight. There's camping, there's bed and breakfast and hotels, and all kinds of really neat ways to see that part of the country. I love this photo. It's so interesting, and one of the fun things about working on this book is that I got to sift through all these amazing photos. There's a lot of, like, the State Historical Society of Missouri. They have thousands and thousands of photos in their archives that you can just browse online. And you're able, for this book, the publisher was able to use anything that is public domain, which is a pretty large amount of these photos. But you can just browse them online. If there's anything that you're interested in, you can just go to the State Historical Society of Missouri website and search and browse and see just really interesting, neat photos. This is another photo of the Missouri wine country out in Herman. Stonehill Winery is kind of the big winery in Herman, and it's got quite a big region, obviously, in Herman. And the reason that a wine country emerged there is because of German immigrants. So a lot of German immigrants came to the Midwest in the 1800s. And they found that this part of Missouri really reminded them of where they were from in Germany. The similar kind of rolling hills, and there were already wild grapes growing in this part of Missouri. And so they were able to use their knowledge of viticulture and get these wine grapes growing. And the Stonehill Winery, I think, is possibly the oldest operating winery in this region. I think there are some that are maybe like founded earlier, but maybe not in the same consecutive ownership and running for the same amount of time. There's lots of, you might have heard recently, there's lots of things going on with Augusta, which we'll talk a little bit talk about a little bit more later, and a developer wanting to sort of create a Midwestern Napa Valley in Augusta. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that, let's just say. This is a photo of the Piers store in Marthasville. And this is another one of the really scenic regions of the trail. It's got a lot of farmland and a lot of forest. And this location is at the start of what's known as the Magnificent Missouri Corridor. There's a nonprofit that started when shortly after the Katy Trail was conceived. Ted Jones, you might be familiar with his name, was the son of the founder of the Edward Jones Financial Company. And he was really instrumental in getting the Katy Trail up and running. He actually had been to a Rails to Trails project in Wisconsin, and he saw this and was just astounded by it, and thought really that we needed one in Missouri. And so he learned about the Katy and really helped get it going. This Piers store and this Magnificent Missouri nonprofit are owned and operated by a gentleman named Dan Burkhart, who worked with Ted Jones and kind of really got involved with this as well. And there's this amazing wildflower garden that they have tended and really encouraged. It's just such a beautiful scenic section of the trail. And on weekends, this Piers store is open, and they have music every weekend, and it's really lovely. And this is, like, as I said, the kind of the start of the wine country out there. There's a lot of nature and wildlife to be seen out on the trail. You'll, especially in the spring, oftentimes just find some turtles, crossing the trail. I happen to love turtles, so every time I see a turtle, I have to stop and take lots of pictures. I included this other photo because it was a summer day when I needed to do one of my rides for researching the book. And so I got up before dawn and drove out there. And I love this, really peaceful, foggy, kind of misty dawn scene. So if you do decide, on a summer day you want to go out to the trail, I really recommend trying to get out there as early as you can, because obviously it's easier on your body when it's hot out, and you get to see really beautiful scenes like this. This is another instance when I was up really early and riding on the trail, but this is in downtown St. Charles. I took this picture from the park that's right in downtown St. Charles. It's escaping me right now, but it's called Frontier Park, I believe. It's where there's a big statue of Lewis and Clark and their dog. And it's close to all the downtown St. Charles, excuse me, shops and restaurants, and that Lewis and Clark Boathouse Museum, which, if you are interested in history and westward expansion and anything related to Lewis and Clark, I highly recommend that museum. It's really interesting. And they have models of life-size models of the boats they used, and a couple times a year they take them out on the river and do kind of a demonstration of what that was like. This is a photo that I took way out past St. Charles, out in that region that I mentioned earlier, where it's very quiet and very rural, and it's kind of a forgotten section of the Katy Trail. A lot of people begin or end their multi-day Katy trip in St. Charles. And there's a good reason for that. There's a lot of services, restaurants, hotels, lots of space, lots of parking space where you can just leave your car for a few days and it'll be okay. And then there's only two more trailheads past that. And they don't have any services really. They're just very quiet little way stations. And so when people do that, they miss things like this. I took this photo last summer, I believe in August, and it's just this huge lily pond. It's just, no one, planted these. It's just this amazing natural scene that it's so incredible. I just love it so much. this is a little bit of a contrast to that. This is also on that section east of St. Charles. It's a really strange kind of industrial section out there. And I was really struck by how interesting this huge stacks of wrecked cars were. And just such an interesting contrast to the rest of the natural beauty of the Katy. So that is kind of my spiel about the Katy Trail. As you can see, I have another book that I wrote a few years ago called Best Hikes with Kids St. Louis. And Katy Trail is a Reedy Press book. You can buy that at reedypress.com. You can go to my website, kathyschrenk.com, and there you can buy both books. So I'd be happy to take some questions. If nobody has questions, I have more to share from the book. I think I was talking about Daniel Boone earlier, who obviously is a really outsized figure in this region. So Daniel Boone, as you probably know, kind of got his start in the further eastern part of the country. He was in Kentucky and then kind of continued moving west when, I guess, Kentucky in 1800 was too crowded for him. So he kept moving west and eventually died in the Augusta, Marthasville region of Missouri. And after he died, some of the folks from Frankfort, Missouri decided it was really the right thing would be for him to be buried in Frankfort. So they came to Marthasville and dug up his bones and took them back to Kentucky. And then there was some debate about whether or not they had the right bones. A very strange story that I thought was really interesting that I learned about when I was researching this book. I think there's a question in the chat. Have you taken a bike on the Amtrak train? Just so, can you tell us more about that process? I've personally not done that, but from what I understand, it's pretty straightforward. When you're buying your Amtrak ticket, you just click a box on the website, or when you're talking to the ticket agent on the phone, just tell them you want to reserve a spot for your bike. And I think the Missouri River Runner is the name of the train that goes out from downtown St. Louis to Kirkwood to Washington and points west. And all of those trains have space for bikes. Let's see, riding in winter, where do you refill water since fountains are turned off or restrooms left open? That's a great question. In the winter, yes, there are a lot of times when the water fountains are shut off. I carry extra water. I just have in my backpack, I have a Camelback type bladder or extra water bottles. In a pinch, there's almost always a gas station or convenience store close by to most of those towns. And sometimes the restrooms are open. If it's a pit toilet, those are left open all winter long, but if it's a flush toilet, they close them. So that is something that you need to think about if you're riding in the winter. I think it's November 1st to April 1st that those bathrooms are closed by the state parks. Other questions?
I'm just going to unmute myself here. Kathy, I love your best hikes with kids in St.
Oh, good.
I've got a husband and 2 teenage daughters. And once I discovered that book a few years ago, I've given it to friends. We've hiked probably the hikes in that book.
That's great.
When I saw you came out with a new book, I actually bought this Katy Trail book already for my husband for Father's Day.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Our youngest daughter is going away to college in the fall, and we hope to have a lot more time for exploring.
Right.
Especially the Katy Trail. But I like about in the book how you talk about the shady parts of the trail, which I'm like you, it's too hot for me here in the summer. I'm not originally area. It's just I have to get out early or in the evening.
Right.
Bearable.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. But thank you for doing writing these books and doing all the research. And it's so great, especially the hikes book. I love how you have where the trailheads are and if there are bathrooms and how you've designed certain, hikes of certain distances. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that. I see Sean in the chat answered the question about bikes. He says, I've taken a bike on Amtrak repeatedly. Really easy, except the right angle turn at the top of the steps. It's a little bit of a tight turn there. Bike just leaned up against the wall of the train. So yeah. And I understand that the Amtrak had some reduced services during the pandemic, but in July, they should start having the 2 trains per day on that Missouri River Runner schedule that they had in the past. So you could go out for the day, take the train out to Washington or Herman and ride on the Katy, and then come back the same day. Trying to think if there's anything super exciting that I missed. Talked about the big Bur Oak. Is the Rock Island making progress towards Kansas City? Yes, that's a great question. I mentioned the Rock Island Trail. It intersects with the Katy Trail at Windsor, Missouri, which is between Sedalia and Clinton, in that kind of westernmost 50 or so miles of the trail. And they are making a lot of progress. I think a new section opened pretty recently. There's lots of information about that online. There's a Rock Island Trail Facebook group. The Rock Island Trail, there's like a nonprofit, I think, that is that updates their website pretty frequently. I don't think it's a state park as yet, so that information is not on, probably not on the state park website yet. One thing that's really nice about the Katy is that it's a state park. It's like the longest state park in the country, I believe. And it's all run and maintained by the Missouri State Parks, which does a great job of signage and maintaining and all that, in my opinion. Joanne mentioned I wrote a book about hiking with kids, and I also have some family outings in my book about the Katy. St. Charles is a really great place to do a ride with kids because there's all those museums and stuff for kids to do in St. Charles, especially like that winter time when if it's not too cold at Christmas. They have all those great costumed folks. Jefferson City is a fun place to take kids. You can park at the Katy on the the north side of the river and then ride across and take that really fun bridge, as I mentioned. And then that Rocheport area where there's a section about 10 miles between Rocheport and that big Bur Oak with that connection to Columbia. 20 miles can be a little bit long for little kids, so you can kind of judge and do an out and back based on the age of your kids and how much stamina they have. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about helmets, because that's what I love to talk about. I love to talk about bike safety, and wearing a helmet is the most important thing you can do to keep yourself safe on a bike. Wear your helmet, always, 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 and then have extra food and water. There are sections of the trail that do not have great cell phone service, so I recommend telling someone you trust where you're going, when you expect to be back, so that if something happens, they can let authorities know, like, might have a flat or something out in the middle of the trail and are having a hard time getting back. But I mean, the Katy is a recreation opportunity that really is for just about anyone. You don't have to take your bike. You can do a hike on the Katy Trail, and I know a lot of folks who actually have done through hikes on the Katy Trail, meaning they start on one end and walk all the way to the other end, stopping and camping and staying at hostels and bed and breakfast. How easy is it to find camping? Basically, all of the towns that have a trailhead. I don't want to say all, but most do. Sometimes it's not like a dedicated campsite, but a lot of times there's just a place in a park where if you know where to go, they're fine with you camping there for free. There is a website called Bike to Katy that has so much information and a lot of really up-to-date information about where to camp and if there are any issues with the trail. It's got a forum that's very active. When you first look at this website, it looks like it's, you know, kind of old-fashioned and was created in the 90s. But it's got very up-to-date information, very friendly folks that will answer questions about where to camp and how frequently you have to stop. But there's a lot of camping. Klondike Park is a pretty close by in St. Charles County place to camp if you want to do a longer ride in that region. Out in Franklin, there's a place right on the trail that you sign in and then you cross the trail and you go to your campsite and it's right there. So like I said, a lot of things have popped up as far as campsites and hostels and bed and breakfasts that cater to bikes, to folks on bikes and their bikes. Joanne says, I'm upset about the planned $100 million renovation near Augusta by a developer. Yeah, I've been hearing about that a lot, and I'm really curious to see what's going to happen. You know, Augusta, yeah, thank you, bikekatytrail.com. You know, I'm not an expert in the wine country out there, but there are, you know, people are concerned that it's going to ruin the rural feel and the nature of the wineries out there. But there's a lot of wineries, and not just in Augusta. They're planning paddle boat rides from Klondike Park, right? Which honestly, to me, riding on a paddle boat on the river sounds pretty fun. But there are a lot of, there's so many wineries out there. Like just the 3 or 4 that are in Augusta, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, Joanne, if you're worried about the wineries out there, I would suggest going a little bit further out and exploring some of the other wineries, because there's some really cool ones that aren't just right there in Augusta. But I understand your concern for sure. It's a lot of people are very, very nervous, and the idea of having a Napa Valley in Missouri is a little bit of a head scratcher. I've lived here since 1998. I've done plenty of winery exploring. I feel like I keep finding new ones. I found a little one way off the beaten path, and they said that they got their grapes from California and then made the wine in Missouri. And it was kind of higher end. It was very quiet, and it was just a friend of mine and I who had ridden our bikes from the Katy. It was kind of near Dutzow, Dutzow, one of the little towns out there. And there's a few wineries around there, and they seemed like they were not really interested, and they were like, oh, okay, I guess we'll sell you some wine. But St. Genevieve, yeah, St. Genevieve has some really good stuff. Even over in Illinois, there's a lot of wineries that I didn't know about until recently. Yeah, there's a lot to do around here. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens with this Augusta Napa in Missouri situation. Yeah, as I said, as far as other development, the Rock Island Trail, which there's also information about the Rock Island Trail at that bikekatytrail.com site. They have a map of the Katy, and then you can click and switch over to a map of the Rock Island Trail. And as I understand it, the hope eventually is to extend that south of where it ends now at Windsor at the Katy Trail, and kind of make a big sort of oval shaped loop. So kind of further down towards Lake of the Ozarks and other regions where there's lots of really cool bridges, which I think would be really fun. There's going to be a lot more, I think, going on with the rail trails in Missouri in the next probably 10 years or so. any other questions just about biking around here in general or hiking around here? Those are my two big things, hiking and biking in Missouri. I'll just say it again, wear your helmet, please. Please wear your helmet whenever you're on your bike. Sean, thank you. I guess, if we don't see any other questions, you can feel free to go to my website. You can email me from there. You can message me, leave comments. As I said, you can buy my books there. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I love the questions and the comments.
Hey, thank you, Kathy, for coming and presenting for us. Thanks everybody for coming. If you are going to go out, having your own copy with you, but if you'd like to just kind of page through the books, we do have them at the library, if you kind of want to check them out, see what they're about, and then grab one for your own adventures.